now is Ken Khachigian. He has worked with both President Nixon and President Reagan, and his new book, relatively new, it's this year, um, is amazing. It's Behind Closed Doors in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. And I don't think that there's anybody I'd rather talk to about what being presidential means and the importance of that. And so I'm going to open this up to you, Ken, to start off with just really wherever you want to begin. So that, but the whole goal is to understand from your perspective, a man that's been in the room, who was personally part of the team that crafted the "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago" line, which I think is absolutely critical this year as well. So, Ken, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Well, I I went to San Clemente with President Nixon after he resigned, and I spent 4 years at his basically at his knee, um, sort of like at the at the feet of Socrates, if you will. Um, and it was when I was in the White House from 70 to 74. I was a more of a lower level player. I was a protege of Pat Buchanan. Pat and I shared an office, and my mentor over all those years. But when I got out to St. Clement, it was the first time I had the opportunity to be face to face and one on one with President Nixon for 4 years, working on his memoirs, and then helping him prepare for those historic David Frost interviews. And it was such an extraordinary opportunity to learn from one of the great presidential giants and political legends of history when we had a series of hours and hours and hours of conversations going back to his career, which began in 1946, a lifetime in politics and international affairs and presidential politics is yours from Congress to Senate to Vice President to the presidency, years of victory, years of defeat, years of his comeback um, from losses in 60 and 62, and then to the presidency, and then defeat Watergate, and then helping him manufacture his comeback after his resignation. And in those years, sitting with him is when I really learned what it was like to uh, what leadership was like and what the monumental growth there was in uh, the minds of great leaders because conversations with him wasn't about any just normal things in life. You sat with him and he talked with about dealing with people like Churchill and Khrushchev and Eisenhower and Golda Meir. I mean, the names that slipped off his tongue. Um, and of course, it was about domestic issues and going back to the days of politics. And of course, him dealing with the people on the other side of the aisle, like Harry Truman or William Fulbright, and people, great senators like Carl Mundt from South Dakota, and congressmen like Charlie Halleck, and or senators like Strom Thurmond. So we had great discussions from those days where I learned from him about the great political struggles of the 50s and 60s and about the ups and downs of the political dynamics of great years that people don't even understand these days because what America went through in the 50s, the civil rights struggles of the 50s, the Cold War, what the Cold War was like. People don't understand what the dynamics were between China and Russia in the 60s. When you think about what Nixon did when he opened China, and I had those discussions with him, people look at China today, and people even visit China, and they see China and they see, well, my gosh, you can get a Starbucks coffee in China, you can drive a Tesla, there's internet cafes, and there's big box stores, and people that are wearing Nike shoes, and Well, it's an advanced country. In the 60s, China was a outlaw nation. It was like North Korea is today. It was full of weird, strange, outlaw, warmongering people. Uh, the Red Guard was roaming the streets, brutalizing people if they thought they were against Mao, and threatening. They were a very threatening nation with thermonuclear power. And then you have the Soviet Union, which was advancing rebel causes across the world, and whether it was in Cuba or Afghanistan or Vietnam. And Richard Nixon inherited this war in Vietnam with 540,000 troops when he came into office. So we had these
I didn't
extreme,
realize there was 540,000 there by the time
oh
he
my gosh,
arrived.
it's terrible.
Mm.
He had
That's
these
crazy.
he had these enormous headwinds when he came into office. People don't even have a concept of the headwinds that he, on January 20th, when he took the oath of office in 69, he had these extraordinary headwinds that he inherited from Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson's policies in Vietnam of 540,000 troops, 500 men, boys being killed every month in Vietnam, and thousands of casualties every month when he took the oath of office, and protests being done all over the country. People think of it as Nixon's war, and yet he inherited all of that. He took that on the first day in office, and he didn't expand the war when he came into office in January of '69. He immediately tried to draw it down. At the same time, he was trying to balance off China and the Soviet Union against one another. So when you ask about presidential leadership, this is what you're talking about. You're talking about this kind of mental capacity of someone who has developed intellectual strength and strategic comprehension of what the office is like over a development of a career that began in 1946 that took him into office into 1969. And then later on, as we can get into this conversation, he took all this accumulated capacity of intellect and transferred it to Ronald Reagan as he advised Ronald Reagan in his campaigns and in his presidency.
I didn't realize that Nixon advised Ronald Reagan. Um, I think that one thing that is sorely missed, and I think that that you would agree with me, is that the depth of education in American history, depth, not, here's a little timeline and you learn a factoid, often wrong, misinterpreted,
Mm-hmm.
uh, just a lie even. And, kids come out and they do not understand the history of their country and the nuances. Um, the only thing that I'd say 90% of high school graduates will ever know about Nixon is
Water.
Watergate and his resignation. And that's sad because firstly, well, it's forget the injustice, but it's also the dumbing down, to use an overused phrase, but it's so apt. Um, so they almost see American history almost in a cartoonish
Mm-hmm.
comic book,
That's
and
right.
not only are they just plain ignorant, but also, by the way, I got that education. I mean, that was my high school education, was just that kind of thing. Um, but then they don't even know when they're being lied to. So they're all these young Marxists, young Palestinian supporters, Hamas supporters, everything. They have no idea that they would be executed, imprisoned in work camps, never seen again, watch their parents slaughtered before their eyes, whatever, in these various cultures and ideological, political um, structures and systems that they advocate for, they'd be dead or almost worse than dead. But they advocate for it because not only do we dumb them down, but the few tidbits they get are so shallow and comic caricatures, right? And so, and I would love to stay more on Nixon. However, I definitely want to keep moving through to the current, and we want to hit Reagan.
Right. Or
But let me ask you a question about Nixon before we move on from there. He was an intellect, right? I'm not talking about some ivory tower thing, but he knew his history. He understood the world. You or I, Trump, Vance, whomever, might disagree on different aspects of decisions that he made or didn't make. But we can say that he was a serious, um, he was presidential, he was serious, and he understood that contrary to what Kamala says, she says, Russia is a country in Europe. Ukraine is a country and it's smaller. And she ties it together by basically saying because Russia's bigger when it invaded Ukraine, that made it unjust. Not like, it was the size. That's how comic book it came down to. I don't think we'd ever get that kind of analysis from Richard Nixon.
it's so intriguing. This was a man who traveled across the world um, bef- uh, during his years in office, whether it was in Congress and the Senate as vice president, even out of office before he became, between the years he was out of office and before he became president. He traveled the world and he studied. Even when he was at home, he constantly studied foreign relations. He studied presidents. He studied foreign leaders. He met with foreign leaders. He met with foreign ministers. He and when entered the presidency, so by the time he entered the presidency, he already knew all the foreign leaders of the world. He knew the ins and out of each country. He had studied international relations. He'd become intimately knowledgeable of not just Europe. He was intimately knowledgeable of Asia, of the Southern Hemisphere, of Latin America, of the African continent. He knew all about those countries in and out. I can't even imagine Vice President Harris knowing anything about Angola or Morocco or Nigeria. Richard Nixon could give you an exegesis about those countries. I'm telling you, you could ask him about Angola and he could tell you the history of that country, or he could tell you about the Nigerian government, and he could tell you about anything about Chile if you asked him about the government and its history, or about Mexico going back to the 50s or 60s. That's how he studied and prepared for the presidency because he was interested in it. He was interested in how the world worked.
Let
So
me
by the
mention
time
something.
of the presidency, he had those leadership.
Right. I think, well, I think leaders obviously have various strengths and weaknesses, but one that I've identified, and then I saw somebody confirm this in another way online, and I thought it was interesting because it was right after I said it, not that they heard me. I had posted on X that I believe that Kamala Harris is one of the laziest politicians that I have ever known of because if I was handed the VP position, which he was, it was a gift. And I'm not talking about DEI and all that other stuff. I'm just saying she was handed this position. And oh, I know what this was relating to. It was the hurricane, and I'll explain. The post was that Kamala Harris has never been at the FEMA hurricane, the annual meeting about hurricane conditions and readiness and blah, 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 whatever. There's an annual meeting, and that Mike Pence went every single year when he was vice president. And I said, but this, and you can see how lackluster and absurd, I think, my judgment is our response has been down where Hurricane Helene has tragically devastated so many states. And of course, we know Biden's not competent, so she should have stepped up. But think about this. And she went into office knowing she, of course, wanted to be president. Would you or would any of these former great presidents or potential or candidates for presidents not say, I'm going to take the 4 years that I'm VP and whatever I'm lacking in, I'm going to become an expert. I'm going to know these people. I'm going to negotiate. I'm going to craft. And I'm going to understand hurricane
Mhm.
disaster relief because this is just part of my job.
Sure.
And then come in 4 years and be able to say, these are a list of my accomplishments and the knowledge that I have because of
Mhm.
these 4 years. She can't say that about anything. But it seems to me like that is a big part of leadership that clearly shows she's not up to the task.
Elizabeth, if I was a Democrat, I know they're trying to pull her across the finish line because they want the power of the office. And that's shameful in a lot of ways because she's monumentally unprepared to be president. But if I was a Democrat, at least I would ask myself this question. Can you put her into the galaxy of the and I'm not a big fan of the Democrats that have served, but I would say this. I do have respect for the people I'm going to talk about. If I'm a Democrat, would you put her in the galaxy of, of Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt and Jack Kennedy and Woodrow Wilson and Hubert Humphrey and J.W. Fulbright and Frank Church and Scoop Jackson and all these great names of the Democratic Party that have led this party in the 75 years that I've just mentioned. Can you put Kamala Harris in the galaxy of those Democratic leaders who have led that party? And it's absurd to even mention her name in comparison to them. And wouldn't you be embarrassed to place her in the names of those people? Uh, because she, yeah, it is chilling. It's chilling to think that that they would foist upon us to make her the leader of the free world. To in some situations where there's international conflict. conflict, that she would be in a position of making decisions that comparable to those the leaders that I've whose names that I've just mentioned, or even Lyndon Johnson for that matter. At least Lyndon Johnson has spent years in the Congress and the Senate, and leader of the Senate, and years in the vice presidency and presidency. As flawed as he was, um, at least he had knowledge of the rules of engagement and how government worked. I don't think she knows how government works because she's disengaged. She's not engaged in her roles that she's served because basically she's been promoted up by appointment up the ladder.
They call it
Yeah,
failing upwards.
yeah,
In California, everybody's a Democrat because you almost can't get elected as a Republican. And I've seen, and I can't verify that this is still known to be true, but a reporter, I don't know if it's David Collier, was trying to find even one case that she actually prosecuted herself as prosecutor. And he has not gotten an answer, and he's done all the searching in the databases and not one case. So there's a lot of like a tissue. It's just a paper tiger. It's just a falsehood. I think that because the border issue and the economy and crime here domestically are such overwhelmingly critical issues, and I agree that they are the top issues. But then you have this other side issue, and I am very, very concerned of foreign policy. I think that we naturally talk about the economy that's crippling us and the border invasion that's a deliberate program. It's a plan, not a bug. And all that's going to come from that if we don't have a change. So that's terrifying. Oh, censorship. I mean, there's so many things. Censorship. Forget the First Amendment. Forget the Second Amendment. These things are so real. But the reality is that we're seeing a foreign policy, geopolitical um, uh, uh, status in the world, situation in the world that is utterly, crushingly scary, terrifying, especially when they talk about nuclear war and Russia. Are they madmen?
Well, uh, let's say uh, Putin decides to expand the war, and maybe decides to distract what's going on in Ukraine and attacks Poland. At the same time, China attacks Taiwan. Hezbollah decides to go into Iran. And at the same time, there is some disruption in Africa. All at the same time, what does Kamala Harris do? If she's asked those questions, I think she'd curl up in a ball and
I should say China is a big country in Asia. Taiwan is a small country and the big country invaded, so it's wrong. That would be,
well, um, the,
all
the,
joking
the,
aside, no, it would be a disaster because she can't even handle a
because
hurricane.
I think if there could be a time when if she took office, I think that's one of the reasons that there was all these problems with President Biden is that uh, Putin knew that he was mentally deficient in the last 2 years, and he knew that what happened in Afghanistan when we precipitously withdrew, that there was an issue with Biden, and they're not stupid. I mean, we could see it frontally, but they have their intelligence agency, so they knew he was cognitively deficient, and there was a cover-up going on. Throughout the United States, but they knew he was deficient, that he probably did not know what to do if he attacked Ukraine. But if there was a further activity, if China decides to move on to Taiwan, North Korea decides to attack South Korea, Iran decides to expand the war in the Middle East, if all that happens simultaneously with Putin deciding to expanding the war into NATO countries, uh, the leadership qualities that we need at the time, and these are some of the things that one of the reasons that I wanted people to read my book is because the threads of the leadership that are shown that went from Nixon through Reagan that are exposed in the secret memos that I uh, talk about, that I published in the book for the very first time, that Nixon wrote to Reagan, and the conversations I had with Nixon and with Reagan about leadership qualities and about the campaigns that we waged in 80 and 84 with Reagan are very important for people to read. I think I was hoping that the folks in the Trump campaign would read my book because it's a roadmap to victory and it's a roadmap to of leadership and communication.
Going on to Reagan.
Yeah.
All right, so he's one of my favorite people ever. And Uh, I've just admired him for so many years. When at his funeral, I remember feeling like an idiot because I couldn't stop. Just tears kept streaming down my face like all day long. It wa and I watched this thing and I couldn't stop. And, so we sorely miss him. I just saw the movie. It was lovely. But, um, I just see the strength and the
Hmm.
confidence and when we saw walls, and we'll get to walls, when we saw walls looking back and forth and seeming so uncomfortable and, just like the deer caught in it, the headlights kind of approach, and Kamala with the cackle. I mean, the Iranians and the Russians want Kamala back and
Hmm.
and Tim. And I think of them trying to work like a Reagan, like to live up to Reagan's legacy of foreign policy of peace through strength, and it's just an absurdity. And by the way, you say you're talking about the Democrat Party because I obviously don't. I agree that those people are great men. It doesn't mean I have to appreciate everything
Right.
that they, you
No,
know,
that's my.
advocate. Right. And but the Democrat Party today is to me such a small and puny and weak and kind of slimy in that they they would rather literally sacrifice our country
Mhm.
for power and give us these, Humpty and Dumpty or no, frickin' frack,
Mhm.
Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. That's what they're like. They're like frickin' frack, two caricatures. And then we have Ronald Reagan. Tell us about your time with Ronald Reagan and the foreign policy aspect of it.
It was amazing. Obviously, in the campaign of 1980, where I first began with him, the focus was not on foreign policy. In fact, President Reagan, President Nixon, who advised him through me on that campaign, was to stay away from foreign policy. So it was the economic disaster of the Carter years and the
Mm.
foreign policy disasters, but mostly the economic policy that got Reagan elected.
Yeah.
But once he got in, uh, uh, and we did give a major speech on at the end of the '80 campaign, which I helped write uh, for the candidate Reagan in '80. It was on American foreign and defense policy. One of the big reasons that to help him get elected was that our defense and foreign policy had been such a failure under the Carter years. As Reagan pointed out, we had Navy was down. We had ships that couldn't float. We had planes that couldn't fly. Our defense capability was a disaster. Defense spending was such a small portion of the GDP. And so when he came into office, he found that there was such international disrespect for America, which was symbolized by the fact that the Iranians could take Americans hostage from our embassy in Iran, um, and just poke their finger in our eye uh, with such ease and keep them hostage for such an enormous period of time under the Carter regime. So when he took office, he saw that America's image abroad was way down and that there was disrespect for America. So Reagan came in and immediately, and that's one of the efforts that he wanted to make sure to put forward when I helped him prepare his inaugural address. Uh, on January 20th, 1981, Reagan instructed me that in the draft that I prepared and that he edited and changed so heavily in his own hand was to make sure that we uh, reset and set forth a very strong uh, international foreign policy and defense policy. And then throughout that administration, he believed that a great foreign and defense policy also rested on a strong economic policy within the country that rested on freedom and strong free enterprise. And that was part of his crusade. Um, he took me aside at Camp David in June of 1981. And one of his great concerns was that the crusade that he so strongly believed in, the economic crusade, and that upon which he thought the strength of America rested, not just the economic strength, but the entire strength of our capabilities abroad and throughout the world, was not being totally fulfilled within his own ranks. And that's what I write about in the book. That's one of the things I had to honestly write about in the book, that his own team wasn't fulfilling his crusade as it was. But as we
Like
talked
Trump,
about,
like Trump, rather, his first term. There were so
yeah,
many apparatchiks, I call them, that
you,
were
you,
opposed to his.
Elizabeth, you put you've got your finger right on, you've got it right on it. It's that problem was exactly the same with the Reagan years, and nobody realizes this, and it had to be written about. And you've got people around you sometimes that don't fulfill your own goals,
Did he battle
but
with the State Department a lot?
he had to overcome the State Department a lot, and the State Department always tries to resist, and they don't want to get into battles. Oh, we don't want to upset people, and we don't want to make them unhappy. And um,
Well, they're staffed. I think the biggest problem that I see that, I'm not sure how you resolve it because I know that it's very hard to fire people that are bureaucrats in the executive branch, but they they're 95 to 99% donors to the Democrat Party. So they do not agree with making America first. They don't
mhm,
agree with the free market economy. They do not agree. I mean, aren't you shocked seeing the New York Times and many other major newspapers questioning or contributors questioning whether the First Amendment is the big problem in America and the Constitution is is really the crisis, is that there's too much constitutionalism. This is all in the last 6 months. I've seen multiple major pieces in the Times and I think the Post. That's insane. But this is what they really are, this is part of, well, this is part of a Marxist ideology. And obviously, Ronald Reagan would be the poster boy against a Marxist ideology. And what I'm seeing, I guess, to put it together is that with Trump Vance, they would have to come in to a bureaucracy, an administrative state that Ronald Reagan probably dealt with. Almost virtually all Democrats or independents that are truly left-wing, leftists, woke, and Marxists even. And how do you deal with that? Because I think what this new administration wants to do is not just suppress it and manage it, but destroy it and restore an America first executive branch. And so I wonder how Reagan would have done that. What did he do while he was there?
well, he tried very hard. That's one of the interesting things in um, the first the chapter in my book that deals with taking office when he took charge right after the inauguration. It's such an uplifting first few uh, paragraphs and pages of that chapter, because the president was so excited in his cabinet meetings. I took such careful notes in those cabinet meetings. He was so excited in the very first 4 or 5 days of taking office, because they were cutting regulations in the various departments. They were cutting bureaucrats out. They were resetting all the rules in the various departments. And he was like a little kid. He was like a kid in a candy store. He was so excited about changing. And but unfortunately, as time passed, as um, John Ehrlichman in the Nixon administration said, what happens is when people go to Washington, they run off and marry the natives, and they go there and they get taken over by the bureaucracy. And as hard as Reagan tried in those first few days and months to try to control the bureaucracy is so entrenched. And I do hope that if Trump wins again, he's talked about unleashing, I guess, Elon Musk to come in and clean it all out. And it's a huge job, but you have to be steadfast. You can't give in. And Reagan tried so hard in those few days, but it was his own team, Stockman and Baker and Darman and others who uh, eventually dragged their feet and said, "Well, we've got to work with the Congress. We've got to work with them. We've got to get things done, and the only way you get things done is to compromise." At some point, you can't compromise. You've got to come in with an iron fist and make changes, and making changes is going to hurt some people.
Well,
But
Ken, I think that today the left, the deep state or the
mhm.
swamp, as some people call, though yesterday my interview said, or day before said, it's not a swamp. Swamps are even kind of nice. He's from the South. He says there's wildlife and all these wonderful things. It's a sewer, Elizabeth, rat infested, dark, without any uh, airflow. It's a sewer. And I thought, well, actually, we should dismantle the sewer system. So it seems to me that back in Ronald Reagan's time, that the idea of the deep state being as nefarious as it truly is, because it's dark and ugly. It's not just a difference of opinion. This is a darkness. I consider it even a spiritual battle. And I don't think anybody at that time, correct me if I'm wrong, saw it as sort of a globalist deep state that had malevolent or nefarious ideas that to undermine and dismantle constitutional republican form of government. I don't think that at least those of us who look at that time and say, well, Reagan didn't get it done, right? I don't think that they had the idea that it was as dire as it was as we do today. And that's why we may have success, because I think all of us recognize just how existentially bad it is.
Honestly, Reagan saw it that way. And it's just that he couldn't get his whole team to come in and help him implement it the way he wanted it done. Because even his cabinet officers, once they got entrenched into their positions, got influenced by their various bureaucracies and their various cabinet departments because they wanted to protect their budgets. They wanted to expand their budgets. They didn't want their budgets cut.
And they were
Uh,
probably already, some of them, entrenched before they
yep.
were even, part of the Washington mindset already. Who convinced him to appoint Sandra Day O'Connor? Was he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor, didn't he?
Yes. Well, that was probably vetted between his attorney general uh, and Ed Meese and Jim Baker had probably a lot to do with it as well. And
I just
I don't.
love Ed Meese, and I just don't understand how anybody would have put Sandra Day O'Connor in front of Ronald Reagan's face. I mean,
Yeah. Well, and he was, but the other thing was that Bill Rehnquist was a classmate of hers at Stanford. And actually, I think it dated her at one point at law school or anyway, but, and I think he was a strongly recommended her.
Huh, whatever.
And
Okay, I'm sorry. I hate to even know that, but I just thought I would ask about that. Um,
I can't say I know all the details, but I do think that Rehnquist was a great supporter of hers.
I like
And,
Rehnquist.
of course,
What about the
Rehnquist,
Department of Education, Ken? Tell me why. That was the Department of Education was a brand new baby cabinet. It was like inconceivable that somebody came up with this idea to federalize education at whatever aspects of it that they called for at the time. And he said, "I'm going to dismantle it or take it out of the cabinet position," and it didn't happen. And so the major regret, I know he was thwarted by probably somebody saying, "Mr. President, you can't do this because," and he took the advice of his colleagues, or maybe he wouldn't have been allowed to actually dismantle it. Did he need a congressional?
you would have to have Congress, yeah. And he had the Senate, controlled by Republicans in those days, yeah, initially, but then you had Tip O'Neill running the House. There was no way he could overcome anything that Tip O'Neill was opposed. See, but once you get something, um, as he used to say, the closest thing to eternal life is the government. Um, and that was the great quote from Reagan. Once you get a department or something in place, it's going to be there forever, and it's only going to grow.
Well, Trump wants to take down the Department of Education. And I hope in the spirit of Ronald Reagan speaks through him and he says, "Do it this time. We've got to get that done." The other thing that I found interesting always was, I'm not sure what year it was when Congress enacted some kind of a bill that required America to recognize Israel's capital as Jerusalem and to move the embassy there. And I know he wanted to do that and he promised to, like every president. And then what Donald Trump says is, as soon as he got into office, it was going to be one of the first things he did. But then an advisor came to him and said, "Well, Mr. President," and blah, 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 blah. And so he waited a year and then he finally did it despite what he thinks may have come from the CIA. His advisor was probably getting from the CIA. Did that happen to Ronald Reagan as well?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, because I wasn't involved in foreign policy
Mhm.
or international decisions. Had intimate knowledge of it. I do know that once again the State Department was very reticent about a lot of decisions. That the NSC, I do know the National Security Advisor, many times people like Bill Clark would give the president good advice on certain decisions, but then he would get contrary advice from Secretary of State George Shultz, who had a much more softer position on international decision making. But at the end of the day, I will say this about President Reagan: even though he decided to ease up on his rhetoric and his the way he approached his views on Gorbachev and the various summits. And I write about this because I was aware of how he did this back in 1985. Even though he softened the rhetoric a little bit, he didn't change his position, and it did result at the very end of bringing down the Soviet Union, ending the Cold. So he had a plan in mind, and it worked at the end of the day. So he softened the rhetoric, but at the end he still had an iron fist that was hidden behind the softening rhetoric. So I do credit
Well, I
Reagan
think
for.
that that's one of the most important things that we can keep in mind. I personally consider Ronald Reagan to be one of the most presidential, and somebody could say, well, what does that mean? You just know it when you see it. He is the
Yeah.
most extraordinary of men, brilliant, and
Yeah.
they made him out, the press made him out to be a fool. I
Oh,
remember
no.
when I was
Right.
young, a friend of my mother's was talking to me about Ronald Reagan in this upcoming election. And he told me, well, he wants to bring in the apocalypse. Now, I was raised Catholic, so I didn't read my Bible until I was an adult, and now I'm not Catholic, but I didn't really know exactly what that meant. And he explained to me, though I know he didn't probably never read the Bible himself. And he said, yeah, he wants to bring in the apocalypse. And that sounded very, very serious to me. And so Ronald Reagan, in a different way, is faced with the same thing that Donald Trump is, that
Mhm.
other Republicans don't face equally because they belittled Reagan when he was a I mean, he was an extraordinary man. They belittled his intellect as if he was that blows my mind the most because this was a man who was a brilliant thinker,
Mhm.
wasn't he? Tell me about that.
I'll tell you, and again, this is in my book. I had these extensive discussions with him. That's covered in. There's 3 chapters which include my extensive discussions with him on economics, and that it comes from the fact that he had when he was on the General Electric circuits, speaking for General Electric. He spent all those years on his own giving those speeches. He didn't have a speechwriter with him. He didn't have a researcher with him. He did all his own research and studying, and he was all by himself in those hotel rooms, lonely, writing his speeches, doing his studying, doing his homework. He was an economics major at Eureka College, and and I was in the room with him with his economic advisors where he's frustrated with him, and so he would sit there and he'd stop and say, "Listen, fellas, I'm going to tell you that the American people don't understand economics the way they should," and he'd go into these long, uh, uh, not diatribes, but lectures
He's
before.
teaching his economic advisors.
Exactly, he was.
Professor Reagan.
Yeah, Professor Reagan teaching his own staff about economics, and I took these notes, and that's why I reproduce them in the book, where he teaches everybody about economics and the free enterprise system, and how the success comes and hope from hope, and people being free to make their own decisions. And it was this really huge brain power that just emanated from him as he's sitting there telling the Council of Economic Advisors and his chief policy people all about economics and the way the free enterprise system works and how it would change the American system and how
Oh,
lower
that
tax.
thing, the free
It was
enterprise system.
it was I mean it's fascinating, and that's why I took such careful notes because I had to write speeches from this. And I had the good thank goodness I had the freedom because I had a one-on-one relationship and prevented people from leaning over my shoulder and telling me what to do, because once the president instructed me on what to put in these speeches about how the system worked, and it went from him to me and then back to him in the speeches. But he was incredible. He had a big mind about the economy and how the American system worked and how the government was oppressive and how you just unleash the people and unleash their own
Their
freedom and enterprise.
desires, we all have um, desires for our life, and those desires are what we will work for if we're not consistently checked by
Right.
government bureaucrats and financial. Yeah, he understood the human spirit. And,
Mhm.
he and Trump, I would say, are very different people, but the core uh, values that they share, one, hard work,
Yes.
which is what I will say that I know Kamala, who didn't even go to one FEMA meeting on hurricanes. And now, you know, the homework's due or the test is today and she's not ready for it. Um, that perseverance, that due diligence, that desire to know and to accomplish something and to acquire knowledge to be better able to put it to use and not to have to be surrounded by people telling you what to do because you don't know. She doesn't have that capacity. And Ronald Reagan, one, and Donald Trump love passionately their country.
People need to realize one thing about Kamala Harris. She's been a government bureaucrat for her entire life. Her entire life, in terms of her employment, has been in some form of government bureaucracy. The last time she probably filled her own gas tank was when she worked at McDonald's.
No, no,
Uh,
no. She filled her car when she was trying to, she was learning how to use an electric power car, and she put the thing in the side of the car, the electrical thing, and she just stood there and held it because it was like she didn't know there wasn't like gas, like a gas station, that you can walk away. It's gonna take several hours, Mrs. Harris. So So there's the love of country, there's the hard work. Ronald Reagan may be more intellectual in the sense that he could explain things, the economics major, things like this. And Donald Trump is a brilliant businessman and he has an incredible grasp of these concepts. They both want to set people free.
yeah.
It's about liberty, this country, and wanting the good, and which of course in America, our birthright is the good of peace, the rule of law, freedom of speech, um, the right to keep and bear arms, and but to pursue our dreams without the government dictating our moves and then penalizing us, whether it's for regulation or taxes, to get us to do other things. They hold these things in common. I mean, President Trump isn't as polished as Ronald Reagan in his speaking. We can agree with that. But tell me what you think about the two men side by side.
Well, I think that they believe in the fundamental things, that uh, our government is better with lower taxes. Our government is better with less regulation. Our government is better with allowing people more freedom, with a strong national defense, with secure borders. Our streets are safer with a strong criminal structure where you stop crime. You have a strong police presence in our streets. Those are all fundamental issues of Republican uh, policies. They, those are. They ask me if people ask me what kind of Republican am I? A Trump Republican? And I say no, I'm a Ken Khachigian Republican because I believe in lower taxes, less government, strong national defense, having safe streets and tight borders. Trump believes in that, and Ronald Reagan believes in that. So that's the kind of Republican both of them are. It's just that they both have different ways of making presentations. And I would like President Trump to be a little more polished in how he presents himself. I, I think I think it would serve him better,
Yeah.
quite honestly.
What do you think of JD? And let's talk a little bit about JD Vance
Uh-huh.
and Tim Walz.
Right.
And you saw the debate.
Yes. Um, I can tell you what I came away from that. If you sometimes it's better to put the television on mute and look at the two figures. Uh, I've been watching politics. I've done 9 presidential campaigns in my lifetime. I've been following politics for over 50 years. So I'm pretty good at messaging and communications. So sometimes I put the TV on mute. Uh, J.D. Vance was much more comfortable. He was much more relaxed. He was much more polished. He was much more at ease with himself. Waltz was frenetic, confused, had a frantic look about himself. Uh, and if you just look at if you watch that debate again and just look at the way the two reacted, Vance would look at him sort of in a bemused way, like, "Geez, what's wrong with this guy?" And Waltz would look over at him like, "Oh, what's he going to say next that's going to confuse me?" And and I saw in J.D. Vance, like, if Trump gets elected, and if something happened to Trump, I saw in J.D. Vance somebody who has a calm nature about himself. So if there's an international crisis or a domestic crisis, I saw J.D. Vance as somebody who can act coolly in a relationship or in a crisis, who can act calmly and sort of sort things out. And then I saw Waltz as somebody in that same situation as being a little frantic and nervous. And when that question was asked of him about being in Tiananmen Square, and he squirmed and couldn't answer it, and finally, after 3 or 4 or 5 tries, he finally owned up to how he lied about it. And he would have been much better off just saying, that was stupid of me. I shouldn't have said that I was
I
in
agree
a
with you 100%, of course, because everything you're saying is just, on its face, it's clear. The question I kept having, because I watched him again in some clips last night, and every time, the first time I was so horrified that I thought, no, that he can't be doing this. This is not happening in front of my face. That this man who knows that stolen valor, Tiananmen Square, trips to China, 30 or whatever they are, number they are, sorry to say this, tampons in boys' bathrooms and children's um having their, against parental permission, the state taking children to be able to perform um, very dramatic surgeries and life-altering and body-altering medical procedures upon them. So these things, like, I would have written and memorized the most spectacularly precise, every comma, this verb, or should it be an adjective? Should we go and had it ready, because any semi-intelligent 12-year-old would know that that was coming, right? And he wasn't prepared. And then the next day, he was asked the same thing. That night in the pizza parlor, he was asked the same thing. The next day, someplace else with Fetterman behind him, and he still didn't even make sense. It's like he didn't get his lie or his on. Does that speak to one, like, a mental, spiritual, intellectual deficiency? I'm not saying like Kamala and him, are dumb as rocks, but I'm just saying where they're so undisciplined, or he is here in this situation, where he would allow himself, instead of addressing an embarrassment, because he obviously lied, instead of addressing it, memorizing it, and being prepared, he just winged it.
I, I think he's nervous about handling critical situations is what concerns me. That he doesn't know how to deal uh, with uncertainty, and that's how I define it. And you have to be able to deal with uncertainty if you're president of the United States. And so we have to look at Walz not as a vice president. We have to look at him as a potential president. And when you're president, you have to be able to deal with uncertainty. And that's the fundamental flaw with both Kamala Harris and with Walz, is that we've discovered that Kamala Harris can't deal with uncertainty when she's asked in interviews, when she's confronted with a question that she's unprepared for, she flies off into this uh, hemispheric area that I can't even describe, like with Oprah the other day, uh, with this floating in this atmosphere that that was so bizarre that it was weird, and so she can't deal with the uncertainties of in confrontation. So that's where I saw with Walz when he was hit with something that was not prepared in his briefing book. That troubled me a great deal. And then he got rattled. When you're rattled in a situation like that, unlike Vance, now Vance was hit with some questions that, yeah, with a lot of stuff, and that was, shook him up a little bit, but he handled it with aplomb, and the answers were inconsistent a little bit, but still he handled it with an assuredness of somebody that I could trust, that could to land on his feet when it's in a bad situation. That probably comes from the fact that he came from where he came from in terms of his childhood, his upbringing, and then how he dealt with his military experience, and then the fact that he was probably a pretty smart guy in law school. I was
I think that second
I was in law
question that
school, as smart as he was.
yes. I think that second question when they asked about climate change or maybe Walls came back to him later. I can't remember if it was at the beginning or in the middle, but when he answered that if you're concerned about climate change, which okay, I have no problem saying I think it's a complete hoax, but I don't think he wanted, man-made climate change going to destroy the world is a hoax. Um, he couldn't go down that road in this short period of time. And so his answer that is a true answer, it's not like it's an avoidance. Look, every other nation that we're buying and importing from is a filthy as far as their energy consumption and um, just the environmentalism in China and other countries like that is abysmal. And so we should be reshoring manufacturing, bringing us prosperity, well-paying jobs, and dealing with the pollution that's, plus you have to ship these things back to America. And I thought that was mighty impressive answer that I had never heard before.
Well, that was one of them, and the way he answered the question on abortion, that he thought, well, we need to find a better, our party needs to find a better way to resolve this issue, and that he understood how some women have to make these decisions, and he sympathized with their concerns. He gave a very balanced answer on that.
Yeah, I thought so too. I think I could have done a better job, but that's because I think he should have dealt with the states' rights and why it benefits liberals and women to have uh, a federation of states that are sovereign and deal with their own thing because their government's closer to them, and then nobody is going to pass a law that affects them negatively that hits all 50 states because they're just thinking of the positive thing. We want abortion in 50 states, but they could just as easily have abortion outlawed in 50 states. So would federalism be better? But let me ask you this. Okay, Ronald Reagan was such an amazing wit in a in a Ronald Reagan way. And he was so funny. And then Donald Trump, people say that when you sit down with him, he is like one of the funniest people that you ever have a conversation with. And I saw him on Greg Gutfeld's show the other day, and it was so brilliant because he wasn't in a rally. He wasn't in an interview. He was just having a conversation that was funny, Greg Gutfeld. I said, it's so likable to see him in this relaxed, this is his element, and he was funny.
I can't imagine her cracking a joke or having a sense of humor, even if she does. She would have the best joke writers in the world. She could tap into the ones at Saturday Night Live. She'd have the best ones that Hollywood could produce.
I've never seen her tell a joke, like start a speech and tell a joke.
She would be fearful. She
Ah,
would be fearful of doing it because she couldn't pull it off. See,
like
that's
when she won't go to that one dinner, I can't remember, it's called,
the Al dinner.
the
Yeah, the Al Smith dinner in New York.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Too
I
afraid
think
to
I think that's one of the things that concerns her is that she couldn't pull off doing humor. That it would be awkward for her. That it would be unnatural and awkward for her to say things funny because it's just so it's un. She is so programmed that she can't become unprogrammed, and humor is sort of you have to look unprogrammed to do humor and to pull it off. And Reagan could do it so well, so perfectly. He was because his timing was so great. And I have to confess that we used professional joke writers for him from time to time, although he had his own storehouse of gags.
My husband is a joke teller. He's always been. He would sit my youngest down and give her lessons on how to tell a joke. I mean, because it's just a thing in our household. And I would say, I'm not funny. And but I think there's this joke and it goes like this. So what's really important about telling a joke? Timing. And it's like, obviously, I probably messed that up. But it's you could have somebody tell you a joke. And if you can't deliver it, you know,
That's
it
right.
doesn't land, right? And
That's
so the fact that Reagan could take that joke that was written for him just like any other comedian and put it out there and make it work, I mean, I think it takes a certain genius to be able to pull that kind of a thing off. Well, what would you like to say? Well, firstly, I recommend to everybody, I think in this time, this idea of, um, especially Reagan. I mean, obviously, I have a bias because I love Reagan so much, but a Reagan who was sort of had a kind of a mission very, very similar to Donald Trump, very different men, but very similar, that to see what he went through. And I find it so interesting because I really didn't know this, that Nixon was advising him behind the scenes, not
right.
hiding, but I mean personally advising him. And then with what Trump is experiencing now, and um, when I pray to God, God willing, he takes office, he's going to be right back where Ronald Reagan was, second term, fighting the establishment and the deep state. And um, I really suggest reading this book. And before we go, let's talk a little bit about the debates, Ronald Reagan and his brilliant moment. I mean, I've watched that clip so many times, and his answers about peace through strength are just they make your heart soar. I really believe that because I guess when you love your country and somebody is able to express what we know is truth, there is such a thing as truth and reality. And that's what I think Americans want more of, an acknowledgement that there's truth and reality and all this other garbage is ideological, manipulative drivel. And when I think about, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? It's so simple. And
Mhm.
I often say, well, often. I often say that sometimes the simplest thing that almost seems the most obvious, like anybody would say today, "Well, that's obvious you would ask that question." But it's like, a magnificent diamond, and, sometimes the simplest, most gorgeous thing is the toughest thing to arrive at, simplicity. How did that come about?
It had never been asked before, and our campaign was actually struggling, Elizabeth, um, um, back then in early October of 1980. We were either treading water a little behind, and I was traveling with then Governor Reagan, and we were in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and we were going into a rally at the Oxford Mall, which is about 25 miles outside of Philadelphia. And I had to come up with some new language. There were some statistics coming out of the Carter administration, and they were touting the economy, and of course, it was horrible. And I had to come up with a new,
Malaise. Remember malaise?
yeah, I had to come up with a new line for Reagan to make some news that night. And it sometimes the typewriter, of course, we used typewriters in those days, not computers. And I had to come up with a new line, and it just somehow came out of my brain, and it was look around you at the price of food, the price of um, your housing, and then ask yourself, are you better off today than you were in 1976? That's how the line emerged from that started at the Oxford Mall in Langhorne, Pennsylvania. And it was just such a logical line. He was asking them, and the PMP and I just pulled up and we found an audio of that speech. By the way, we
Oh,
just
you
found an
did?
audio.
Is
Yeah,
it online?
we're gonna put it online. Yeah, we
Good.
we're,
Send it to me.
we're gonna,
DM it to me.
yeah, we will. And we've got about a minute and a half clip of it, and it's wonderful. And and it's a whole litany of things, and the audience says when he asks, "Are you better off?" and they said, "No, no, no." If, do you feel like it's easier to buy food now? Easier, you know, spend money on cars? No, it's that kind of thing. And but it all emanated from that one line. You ask yourself, "Are you better off today than you were in 1976?" And then it morphed and morphed, and then when the debate came with Carter in October, 3 weeks later, October 28th, uh, he tweaked it, and then it became, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?"
The
So
nice thing
that,
about the tweak is that it can be used again. It
yeah,
becomes iconic in the sense that it's timeless.
yeah,
Um,
came the one of the most iconic lines in political rhetoric. Yeah,
when he uttered those lines, was that 79?
no, it was 1980.
Okay, it was 80.
Yeah,
Alright.
it was
Oh, yeah, because
October.
79 was the, Iranian Revolution.
Yeah,
Um,
It was October 7th of 1980 at the Oxford Mall in Langhorne, Pennsylvania.
and then when he uttered it in a speech, not a speech, in the debate, was it a
That's
de
he transfer. We used that line again in L.A. A week later, and then in the debate, he in his closing line in the debate, then he said, "Ask yourself, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" And
yeah. Did
that's
people so
sealed
that
the
was a
deal.
national debate. What was the reaction by reporters covering the debate and the campaigns? Did it have the effect, like, with social media, that would be the clip that would go around, you know
It's interesting. I think that after the debate, I don't think that's the one that really, I think that line stuck in the minds of people that were watching the debate. But I think the media picked up on the line where he said, "There you go again."
Oh, yeah.
Uh, when
I like I mean, that was really good. And of course, his subsequent one about Mondale's age
well,
is
that was in '84. Yeah,
absolutely utterly timeless. But to
yeah.
me, um, Are You Better Off Than You Were 4 years ago has
That
great
I think
depth
that
of
stuck
meaning.
in minds, but it didn't necessarily at the time. Really, I don't think reporters picked up on it, and even I didn't pick up on it necessarily when I watched the debate because I was so focused on him. Um, Two things: one, Carter making the stupid comment about consulting Amy, his daughter Amy, about nuclear weapons.
I forgot all about that. Oh
Yeah,
my gosh.
and then when he was
Nuts.
Carter attacked him on Social Security, and then Reagan said, "Well, there you go again." So that was sort of the soundbite that got picked up by the networks, and
You
and
know, that whole thing, okay,